Welcome back to Bound for Oregon. We are going to read chapter 9. Okay? They were just getting to the river and she was getting very lonely and Mary Ellen needed her grandma. She wrapped up in her quilt at the very end. Okay, chapter 9. It was mid-June now, the month of roses. I looked for wild rose bushes as I walked behind the wagon on the heavy, hot sand road that wound next to the Platte River. And finally, one day, I found one, its tight, pale pink buds almost ready to burst into bloom. As we made our way up the river, we passed by Fort Kearney, a small military post with buildings made of sun-dried bricks. Okay, I'm going to stop right here for just a second. If you will go to the map that's located towards the front of the book, and if you look at Fort Kearney, it's stop number 3 right here. So they've come from here all the way up to here so far. Arkansas to here to there. Okay? So they've got a little ways to go yet. Okay, they've got a lot of ways to go yet. Okay? These were the first man-made structures we had seen in over 200 miles. We were hoping to reach the next fort, Fort Laramie in Wyoming, by the 4th of July. That would be close to 700 miles we had traveled since leaving Independence. But even then, Father said, we would still not be halfway to Oregon. With all of his care, some of the oxen were still limping. And Rover kept on lagging far behind the wagon. "Here, Rover," called John one day, flashing his quick grin. "I'll give you a lift." Leaning over, he scooped up Rover and placed him on the front of him on the horse. "Right, horsey!" Cynthia laughed and clapped her pudgy hands, but Rover wasn't happy with the idea, and neither was Polly. She kicked and Rover struggled so desperately that finally John had to put him down. "All right, have it your way," he said. The next day he tried again, and after a few days, both dog and horse became resigned to it. It was a comical sight to see Rover sitting up straight in the saddle in front of John, barking at rabbits and prairie dogs as he rode along. We continued to meet many other wagon trains. One, which I was especially noticed, had the words "Sure" and "Swift" painted on its wagon covers. The wagons in this train were pulled by fast mules instead of oxen. And its people dressed in style. They seemed to be looking down their noses at us as they sailed past our slow-moving wagons. Mrs. Grant said she had heard that they had music in their camp every night and used silverware and real white table linens for dinner. After this train passed us, they would camp for several days so we would catch up with them. But then a day or two later, their mules would go breezing by us again. I couldn't help but feeling a little twinge of envy at how easy their journey seemed to be. The road we traveled on now had been beaten down by thousands of hooves. On dry days, billows of dust rose from beneath our wheels, and when it rained, tiny streams turned into bogs and mosquitoes swarmed, making a small cloud around each of the oxen's heads. David Grant called them galley nippers. We slapped and scratched. Poor Cynthia's face was covered with huge red welts. Some nights we could hardly sleep because of all the galley nippers buzzing in our ears. We were also having trouble with drinking water. The water in the Platte was so warm and muddy, it was barely fit to drink. We had to let it settle before using it. One time, John measured the water in his tin cup and found that a bottom fourth of it was all mud. Since we had crossed the Platte, wood for the fires had been getting scarcer and scarcer. One evening, there was none to be found anywhere. "We can't cook without fires," said Mrs. Grant in dismay. "And how can we have fires without wood?" Mr. Grant looked at her, a hint of a held-in grin showing in his eyes. He's got an idea, doesn't he? "I'll show you," he offered. In just a few minutes, he had picked up an armful of buffalo chips, the dried old droppings from passing buffalo that littered the grass around us. Gross. Setting a match to them, he soon had a good hot fire. Both Mrs. Grant and Mother turned away, covering their noses at the smell. "I can't cook our food over a fire like that," Mother complained to Father. Her face was pale, as if she might actually be sick. It is hard, Angelina, I know, he replied gently, but we have no choice. If there is nothing to cook with except buffalo chips, we must use them and be grateful for them. Mother still did not like it. However, buffalo chips were the only fuel available. At first, she handled them gingerly, like wearing gloves and holding them at arm's length, with a look of great distaste. But within a few days, she had Lavina and me helping her, piling them into our aprons with hardly a thought. As we moved along, we began to see more and more signs of distress ahead. Sometimes it was worn out oxen abandoned to the wolves. Sometimes it was broken down wagons with tires off and wheel spokes snapped. In some cases, Father told us, what was left had been converted into two-wheel carts so the travelers could go on. Another time we came upon the remains of an ox that looked just like Star, one of Mr. Tedros's oxen. I thought of Sarah Jane and wondered how she was making out, and quite frequently now we would see a freshly dug grave where some poor traveler had been buried. It's not an easy trip. One afternoon, as I was walking along, keeping an eye out for more roses, I saw a wagon moving toward us at an unusually fast pace. As it came closer, I could make out a bearded man with a wild-looking eyes beating his oxen with a whip to make them go faster. His wife and about 6 fair-haired children, freckle-faced, peered out at us from inside the wagon. Sorry, got this. Their faces full of fear. "It is the cholera," the man called to us without stopping the wagon. "It's terrible upriver. Whole families are being wiped out, so we are just going back home." And snapping his whip again, he moved hastily on his way. Mother's mouth tightened at the news, and I thought I could see new lines of worry creasing Father's forehead. We had already heard rumors of an epidemic of this dreaded disease raging along the river. It struck suddenly, with severe vomiting, diarrhea, and high fever. Its victims would lapse into unconsciousness and often be dead within hours. That night, Father and Mother and the Grants talked for a long time in low, concerned voices, but there was nothing to do, they decided, but go on. Taking as many precautions as possible, we planned to keep moving as fast as we could. And Mother told Lavina and Cynthia and me we were to stay close to the wagon at all times. This kind of relates to what we're going through now, kind of this whole pandemic thing where we're quarantined. They're kind of keeping to themselves, which will be easier because there's no one around them at this point. But had they been in contact with people? I'm thinking, gonna make a prediction. Since they're talking about this and going into length, I'm gonna say I'm thinking that something's probably gonna happen. Okay, let's go on. Soon we began passing other wagons that had been forced to a halt because of illness. Father and Mother tried to help some of these families by offering our medicines and the small supply of milk that Blackie still gave. Father also gave advice on caring for the sick. Others, in their frantic haste to escape the place of infection, kept on traveling as fast as they could, their sick ones jouncing and jolting inside the wagons, and every day we passed more fresh graves. One day, just after we had stopped for nooning, Lavina came to Mother, her usually pink cheeks suddenly pale beneath her sunbonnet. "I don't feel well," she complained in a small voice. In just a few minutes, she was violently sick. "We will have to make camp right here," Father decided quickly. He and John set up the tent some distance away from the wagon, made up a bed inside, and carried Lavina to it. "Now everyone must stay far away," he warned. Only an hour later, Cynthia also turned pale and began to whimper and hold on to her stomach. Soon she was just as sick as Lavina. Father laid her down next to Lavina inside the tent. For the remainder of the day, he took charge of caring for them. The rest of us hurried about trying to help. John and I had to look after the animals, keep a fire continuously burning, fetch water and keep it hot, and help Mother with the cooking. Lavinia and Cynthia were suffering from terrible cramps and chills, and they were constantly in need of something. As I went from one chore to another, all I could think about was that the thing we had dreaded most had happened. My 2 little sisters had cholera. The Grants made camp a considerable distance away to keep clear of the infection. but they promised to wait for us, offering to do anything they could to help. There was not much to be done, though, without a doctor or other medical help nearby. That night, Father slept just outside the door of the tent. John was underneath the wagon, and Mother and I were alone inside. It was close to midnight when she came to bed. I couldn't sleep and was trying to read by the light of our little oil lamp hung up by the ridge pole, but I couldn't seem to read either. Mother's face looked different than I had ever seen it. As she slowly removed the combs from her hair, it tumbled down over her shoulders, soft and shiny, as yellow as almost as yellow as Cynthia's in the lamplight. The light illuminated the planes of her cheekbones and the curve of her neck. She seemed beautiful to me in that moment, but then I saw her eyes. In them was a strange, awful blankness, as if she had been stunned by a blow she had not seen coming. The dim light made it hard to be sure, but I thought saw tears streaking her cheeks. "Have you said your prayers, Mary Ellen?" she asked, in a voice that was barely a whisper. Without waiting for me to reply, she knelt down. Quietly there in the shadowy dark, I joined her, and side by side we offered up our prayers for my sister. "Bless them and keep them, O Lord," Mother finished, her voice breaking just a little at the end. "Amen." I felt tears beginning to burn in my eyes. "Amen," I echoed. Outside, the night seemed suddenly hushed. Maybe I thought hopefully they were sleeping. Then in the darkness I felt Mother's fingers reach out and touch mine. Cool and firm, they squeezed once and they were gone, but their touch lingered on like a prayer. "Try to sleep," she said softly, a minute later, blowing out the lamp. And surprisingly, I did. When I awoke the next morning, I was puzzled for a moment to find myself alone in the wagon. Then with a pang I remembered Louvina and Cynthia. "How are they?" I asked anxiously, poking my head outside. In the daylight, her hair tucked back tidily, wearing her apron, Mother looked herself again, piling coals on top of the Dutch oven to cook the biscuits. Only her eyes were grave. "Your father says that Cynthia is not nearly as bad as Louvina," she answered. "Very sick." I felt as if I ought to whisper as I moved about that morning doing my chores. On my way down to the river for water, I passed by the tent. Through the opening, I caught a glimpse of Lavina's face. It was so white and still, I hardly recognized it as my sister. Feeling a sharp pinch of fear way down in my insides, I hurried past. Many other wagons were stopped near us. The cholera epidemic had been growing worse by the day, and nearly every evening we heard about a new illness or death.